Hello everybody, and welcome to my Theros Beyond Death set review for all of the green cards in Theros Beyond Death. We're going to be evaluating each and every one of them for limited, but before I dive in, I do want to remind you that if you enjoy the video, be sure to hit that thumbs up button to help me out a ton. Click that subscribe button so you don't miss any future videos, and leave a comment in the comment section down below if you have any questions or feedback on my grades. I really do love discussing cards, and I would be happy to answer any of your questions, but without further ado, let's get to the grading scale. We are going to be using an A through F scale, but as always, the most important thing is not necessarily the letter grade, but what I say about the cards. But the grading scale is as follows. The A's are the best cards in the set. The bombs, they are the cards you're most hoping to open. Pack one, pick one. The B's are the cards that actively pull you into the color. They're going to be the best cards in your deck, and generally you're going to be taking these early on in a pack, maybe picks 1 through 3 in a pack. And you're almost always happy to draw these in games of limited. C's are the solid playables. They're the cards that are going to be making up the bulk of your deck, but they're by no means bad. They're just solid, they're archetype staples, and they are going to be fine cards in your deck. D's are filler. They're a little bit below average. They're cards that you'll begrudgingly play, or maybe they're clunky removal spells that you have to play, things like that. They're not generally cards you're happy playing, but you end up playing them a decent amount. You'll generally have a few D's in your deck no matter what you do, but the best decks won't have any of them at all. F's are unplayable cards. They're generally just worse than putting a basic land into your deck, and a lot of the time they're just completely blanks. Sideboard cards are cards that are only good out of the sideboard, but when you do bring them in, they are quite potent, so they get a special sideboard grade. Build-around cards need a little bit more work than other cards to be effective, but when you put in that work, they can sometimes be among the best cards in your deck, so they get a special build-around grade. Next up, we're going to be talking about the green archetypes, because when you're evaluating the cards, you need to be aware of the potential synergies going on around them. These aren't by any means the only things you can do in these color combinations. These are just some of the more supported things in those sets. So green-white is the Auras color combination. This is partly due to the fact that white features some creatures that care about being targeted by spells, which means that you'll get team-wide buffs if you target them with an aura. There's also cards like Heliod's Pilgrim in white, which lets you search an aura out of your deck, and green has some pretty potent auras to go searching for. And then there are a couple of other cards that work well with auras, like the green-white uncommon. So there's also of course, pretty standard things you can be doing in green-white. You can be beating down, but auras is some little extra synergy to be looking for, along with constellation type stuff. Constellation is also heavily found in blue-green. This is another archetype that really cares about enchantments. Enchantment creatures are going to be very good in this color combination, as well as cards with the constellation mechanic. Green-black is a graveyard value deck. It seems like a pretty good home for the escape cards, because there is some self-mill that you can be using in this color combination, and you just can go to the late game and then escape a couple times and pull ahead with that value. Red-green cares about 4-powered creatures. There are several cards that trigger if you have a 4-powered creature, so when you're playing red-green, prioritize those creatures a little bit higher. It is an aggressive deck, but it can go into the late game pretty well because it does have some pretty big creatures. Now, let us get into the individual card-by-card review. Gift of Strength is a classic D+ combat trick. In this set in particular, since it is not an enchantment and does not work well with any of the synergies really, it is not going to be anything special, so it's just a D+. You will play it sometimes. It'll work out solidly, but it's not a card that you are super happy to have to play. Next up is Hyrax Tower Scout. This card is a pretty classic C. A 3-mana 3/3 without any text is oftentimes going to be a C, and Hyrax Tower Scout, even with the little extra upside of its ability, is going to fall into that camp as well. One thing to note is that you can use this ability if you're using a mana dork to cast Hyrax Tower Scout. There is a mana dork in green that taps for mana, so you can essentially make Hyrax Tower Scout cost a little bit less if you are using it to cast Hyrax Tower Scout, but typically you're just using this to give a creature pseudo vigilance and untapping it after combat. The ability is not super relevant. It's a 3-mana 3/3. You're going to be pretty happy playing this card. It is a C. Next is Elysian Caryatid. This is the card that I was just talking about with the Scout that can untap it. Elysian Caryatid is a very good card. I'm going to give this card a B-. There are some cards that punish 1 toughness creatures in this set, but that also applies to those creatures attacking and getting blocked by like a 1/1 creature, and Elysian Caryatid is basically never blocking. A 2-mana mana dork that can tap for 1 mana and oftentimes even 2 mana relatively early in the game is quite powerful and worth building your deck around, though keep in mind that you don't want this in a super aggressive deck, and you do want to be putting some cards that are a little bit expensive in your deck if you have Elysian Caryatid, 5-drops and a couple 6-drops maybe, because you want to be making use of that extra mana, because if you're not using the extra mana, you've just played a 2-mana 1/1. That being said, I think you're going to be able to do that, and Elysian Caryatid is one of the top green commons. Next up is Inspire Awe. This card is either a very marginable sideboard card or just a straight up F. I'm leaning towards straight up F. F. You probably shouldn't be playing this card. If your opponent's doing really suspicious things with holding up 4 mana and one of them's green, maybe keep this card in mind. You don't want to get blown out by it after all. But it's just really hard to guarantee that you're going to have more enchantment creatures or enchanted creatures than your opponent, because there are just so many of those in the set. So I think this card is just an F. Next is Loathsome Chimera. This card is a C. It's pretty much, it looks understated on its surface. A 3-mana 4/1 is generally not good, especially in a set where there are some 1/1 tokens that can block. Keep in mind that the 1/1 red satyr tokens cannot block, but there are some 1/1 tokens in white that can really punish this card, and there are some ping effects. But the fact is this has some synergy with the red-green deck because it does have 4 power, so it triggers some of your other cards, and it might not be the best card to escape because a 5-mana 5/2 is also not super good, but escape is pretty much free value tacked onto a card that is already like okay. Like without the escape, this card would probably be a D+, but there's also the ferocious stuff to keep in mind, which is the 4 power and more. That's like a name mechanic for 4 power and more. And also there is escape as well. So I think this card is going to be a pretty typical C. It's going to slot into some of your decks nicely, but you're not going to be too sad if you don't end up with these. They are not really worth a super high pick. Next up is Moss Viper. This is also a pretty typical C. It just is really, especially if your deck is slower or more controlling, because it really just makes it irritating for your opponent to attack you with their bigger creatures. Some of the bigger creatures in this set don't even have a trample, so they won't even get through for any damage with a Moss Viper, and Moss Viper can single-handedly blank a lot of decks. So this card's a pretty good C. It's not going to be a C+ because it doesn't attack super well, and oftentimes it will trade off for like a 1/1, or it can get pinged to death, but I still think I'm going to start with this at a C. Next up is Nexus Wardens. This card's also a C. 3-mana 1/4 reach is the stat line on a Hitchclaw Recluse, which is always a little bit below average, which is probably a C-, but the fact that this can gain you 2 or even 4 life over the course of a game is quite important, and there are a decent number of 3-powered or less flyers in the set, so Nexus Warden seems like it lines up well against the format. One thing you want to make sure is that you're only putting this into a deck that is more defensive, or you're siding it into matchups where it really does work against the flyers, because if you're trying to beat down a 3-mana 1/4 really does not help with that plan. Next is Nylea's Forerunner. 5-mana 5/3 trample is not the greatest stat line. It's a little bit, it needs just a tiny bit extra. Like if it was a 5-mana 5/4, I'd be really thrilled with this card, but the fact that it gives all of your creatures trample is really big, because there are not a lot of tramplers in this set that have it naturally, so this can actually do a lot of work helping you out, and it is an enchantment creature, so I think that those two factors combined make this go up all the way to a C, but nothing more than that. Next is Nylea's Huntmaster. I'm actually a pretty big fan of this card. I think it's a C+. The fact that it's a 4-mana 4/3 means that it will trigger all of your ferocious cards relatively early on in the game, and also buffing your creature. It's going to give at least +1/+0, but oftentimes will give +2/+0 or even more in the late game, and that can facilitate some pretty nice attacks. So I think this card's going to be a C+. You're going to be prioritizing this effect, and I think it's going to be pretty good in your decks. It works particularly well if you have some creatures with evasion or lifelink, because that'll the evasion will make sure that the creature connects for that bonus damage, and lifelink will really help stabilize you or give you a lot of life points boost. Or trample, it also works well with pretty much any. Trample is kind of a form of evasion, but yeah, for sure. I think Nylea's Huntmaster is a C+. Next, Nyxborn Colossus. This is the arbitrary green fatty in the set. It is relatively hard to cast. 3 green is not like a walk in the park, and even sometimes in your 2-color decks, by the time you get to 6 mana, you're going to have like 4 mountains, 2 forests, and then you're going to be a little bit sad. I think Nyxborn Colossus is a D+. It's just super expensive. You don't generally get rewarded for playing just a big creature in this format. I think you're much more rewarded for playing smaller creatures and then suiting them up with enchantments. It is an enchantment creature, which can be relevant, so I think it's a D+. You'll play it if you have a couple of ramp cards, or you really need some big card at the top end, but generally you're not going to prioritize taking this card, and you'll probably be able to get them if you want them. Next is Omen of the Hunt. This card is actually super hard to evaluate in a deck that cares about getting a basic land that is not one of your main 2 colors. So in a 2-color deck, this card's nothing special, but if you are in a deck that cares about getting a splash color, something like that, Omen of the Hunt can really pull its weight, and I think that in those types of decks, this card is going to be pretty fantastic. It also triggers Constellation at instant speed, which can be quite relevant, especially in the blue-green color combination. So I think that in aggressive decks, you're not going to want this card. It's just straight up like unplayable in aggressive decks. But in the more mid-rangey decks, the decks that care about Constellation, the decks that are considering splashing, this card is going to be a solid C. And sometimes you're even going to prioritize it more, because if you are going to splash, you're going to value this as like a C+. But it's very contextual as to what deck you're playing. Don't just treat it as a catch-all, oh, I have this card, I'm going to play it. It's not the type of card you play in every deck. I also think this card gets much better in sealed, because in sealed you tend to splash a lot more. So if you open your sealed pool and you see that you have like 2 Omen of the Hunt, look at if you can build a green splash deck. Next is Plummet. This is a pretty classic sideboard B. It kills if your opponent has several flyers, like good targets, like a couple of 3/4 flyers maybe, or 3/3s, or even 2/2s, but you generally want to have some pretty beefy flyers before you want to bring this in, because it is high risk of missing. But if your opponent presents you a couple targets in game 1, don't be afraid to side this in. I don't think I will currently main deck this in game 1, even though there are formats where I would do that. It also gets a little bit better in sealed and more likely to be main deckable, because flying is pretty good in sealed, but I still wouldn't main deck it. I think it's a sideboard B, but you don't really need to you don't need to main deck it. Next is Relentless Pursuit. This card is a pretty good card, especially for the black-green deck that cares about putting cards in the graveyard, because it puts 3 cards into the graveyard all by itself. Looking at the top 4 and getting a creature or a land is essentially a green version of Divination, even though there is some chance that it will whiff. Maybe you don't reveal a creature, that's probably more likely, the more likely one that you whiff on. But even if you only draw 1 card, you're going to be drawing you're going to be putting several cards into your graveyard to fuel your escape. I think this card's a C, but in the escape deck, I think the first copy is really high value, so I think the first copy is a C+ in the escape deck, but in most decks it's probably just a C. And if you're super aggressive, you don't really want this type of effect, so I think it's probably a C- in more aggressive strategies. But regardless, I think this card is going to be a pretty good staple of the format, and if you are a escape deck, you might even want multiple copies of this just so that you can fuel your graveyard, because fueling your graveyard is essentially drawing extra cards because you're getting those free value creatures from the graveyard. Next is Return to Nature. This card's actually quite good in the format, because destroying target enchantment is actually equivalent to a removal spell in many cases, and if your opponent has a pesky escape creature, you can also get rid of that. One thing to note, you cannot respond to them escaping the creature by exiling it. You have to destroy the creature. You have to exile the creature before they announce the escape, because by that point it's already on the stack. But the fact that you can get rid of escape creatures, the fact that you can get rid of enchantments, means that this card's probably going to be a C+. You're going to like the first copy of this is going to be very valuable for your green decks, and I think that it's going to be quite good. Instant speed removal is going to be very good for green here. Next up is Cetizen Skirmisher. This is one of the worst Constellation payoffs because it's only a temporary buff. +1/+1 till end of turn. Turning a 2/1 into a 3/2 is nothing too special. So I think this card's probably just a D+. I'm not going to be super happy taking this, even unless I'm like all enchantment. So this is consistently a 2-mana 3/2. I'm just not going to be super happy. The reason being is that you're not getting a ton of extra value by giving this +1/+1, because if they block your 2, the real classic case is I play my 2-drop, you play your 2-drop, and then I attack mine in. If I'm attacking with my 2/1, it's still going to trade even if mine is a 3/2. It does get a little bit better if you have some enchantments with flash that are combat trick based, because then it can really surprise your opponents, but even in that case it's probably still a C-. I'm going to start with this at a D+. Next is Cetizen Training. Goes well with the other Cetizen card. I think this card is great. It's a cheap way to enable Constellation, a cheap way to target your creatures for the pseudo-heroic mechanic, and when your creature dies, as it inevitably will because there's not a toughness boost, this card also goes to the graveyard to help fuel escape. I think this card's a C+. I think you're going to be willing to play multiple copies of this. It's going to fuel multiple archetypes, and giving your creatures trample is no joke, because a lot of relatively big creatures just do not have trample in this format. I think Cetizen Training is going to be pretty good, especially because it looks like it's a relatively minor impact. It just has so much synergy with the rest of the set. Next is Skola Grove Dancer. This card is much better than the other 2-drop we just saw, the 2-drop creature we just saw. I think this card is going to be a C, maybe even a C+, though that is a little bit much. The fact is, it's just a 2-mana 2/2 that is an enchantment creature, and that's going to be something that green is quite interested in, and the ability to start fueling your escape cards later in the game when maybe you have 3 extra mana and gain a little bit of extra life on the way. That's pretty minor. I don't see that coming up all that much, but it's a nice upside to have. So this card's going to be a C. And if you really care about enchantments, maybe you'll take it a little bit higher than that. But overall, 2-mana 2/2 with a little bit of upside is pretty much what you can expect here. Next is Voracious Typhon. I have this as the best green common right now. There is a lot of competition in green, but this card just strikes me as very scary. 4 mana for a 4/4 is already pretty good stat line. It's also got Escape, so you can make a 7 mana 7/7, which is really the big creature you're scared, like you would be scared of if you're sitting on the other side of the battlefield. It sits in play to trigger your ferocious cards, and overall it is a really nice payoff for the deck that self-mills a little bit. So I think this card's going to be quite good, and really does demand real answers when you play this. So if you're the opponent and if you are playing against this card and you have something like a pacifism effect or a way to make this card stick on the battlefield but not actually go to the graveyard, maybe consider saving it for this in games 2 and 3 when you know they have it, because this is the type of card that really demands an answer. And if they can bring this back multiple times, if you ever escape this twice, you're in very, very good shape. But yeah, this card seems fantastic to me. Our final common is Warbriar Blessing. This card is also fantastic. I have this actually as the second best green common, just because it's an aura, so it triggers all the stuff that cares about that. It triggers Constellation on those cards that matter, and it's a great fight spell that will enable you, like that plus 0/+2 is actually pretty good for fight spells, because it'll let you trade your 3/3 for their 3/3 for only 2 mana, 4/4 for their 4/4, and green has some pretty big creatures. And the fact that it sticks around is really nice, because turning a 4/4 into a 4/6 is no joke, and really makes your opponent have to maybe even add an extra blocker to get rid of the creature. So Warbriar Blessing is fantastic, and I'm going to give this card a... Oh, I forgot to give Voracious Typhon a grade. This is a B-. It's on the upper end of B-. It might even be just a straight up B, but you're going to want to be taking this card super highly. Yeah, I gave that card a grade. Warbriar Blessing is also going to be a B-. It's just going to be a fantastic card. And it's a pretty solid B- at that. That's going to do it for the green commons. Our top 3 commons are Voracious Typhon. This card's just great. It's a B- or even maybe a B. Just a super huge threat. Warbriar Blessing is a great removal spell. It just works with all of the synergies in the set and can get rid of pretty good threats if you make sure you have big enough creatures. And then Elysian Caryatid works pretty well with the Voracious Typhon, because you can use that extra mana pretty effectively. And the fact that it taps for any color can be valuable for the green multicolor deck that potentially exists. I didn't mention that before, but that is definitely relevant upside. And yeah, it's just a pretty good card as well. Moving on to the uncommons, we start with the Binding of the Titans. This card has a lot of text, but it essentially boils down to you spinning your wheels a lot and really not being worth it. I think this card's a D-. You can play it, but it's not going to do very much, and it just takes too long to get you your card back. So I think this card is quite poor, and is one you're not going to want to be playing. Next is Chainweb Arachneer. This card is actually fantastic. It's a straight up B. The fact that you can essentially... You have an early creature that can chump block for free, and then you have your escape on it that can kill an opposing flyer pretty much guaranteed, and be a 4/5 is just quite good. There was a card in Innistrad that was a 6-mana 4/5, I believe, that killed an opposing creature with flying, and when you escape this, you're essentially getting that, and that card was really good as well. And Chainweb Arachneer is definitely great. I think this is just a straight up B. One thing to note about escape cards, though, is that unless you're fueling them, they do have diminishing returns in multiples, so if you have like 2 escape cards, the third one gets a lot less valuable unless you're doing a dedicated escape deck, because the fact that you can escape the same card multiple times mean that you don't really need more than one in your graveyard at the same time, as long as the ones that you do have are pretty good. So if I already had one of the 4-mana 4/4s and a Chainweb Arachneer, further copies of the 4-mana 4/4, they're still good because it's a 4-mana 4/4, but maybe copies of the 3-mana 4/1 that has escape into a 5/2 become less important for your deck. But Chainweb Arachneer is definitely a good card. Destiny Spinner is also a great card. This card also, I think, is a B-, but it's a pretty high-end B-. It's probably better than Voracious #1, probably better than the +0/+2, so maybe it's just a B. This card's a 2-mana 2/3 enchantment creature, which is going to fuel a lot of your synergies. Even just a 2-mana 2/3 is great. And then in the late game, if you have several enchantments just sitting in play, you can start making your lands into like maybe even 4/4s, that type of thing. It's going to be quite a good card. I'm just going to give it a straight up B. This card's fantastic. Next is Hydra's Growth. This card is tricky to evaluate. I think it depends on how many +1/+1 counters you have in your deck, and I haven't seen a ton of +1/+1 counter synergy so far. But essentially, this card, you put it on your creature, maybe trigger some Constellation stuff, maybe trigger some Auras Matter stuff, but then you kind of have to wait for 2 turns or so before it becomes like actually a real benefit, because you put the +1/+1 counter on it, so it's got +1/+1, and then the next turn you put another +1/+1 counter on it, so you put 2 +1/+1 counters on a creature for 3 mana at sorcery speed with all the downsides that come with that, which is just not great. And then the next turn you put 2 counters on the creature, so you've given a creature +4/+4 for 3 mana, so it's a slightly better Oaken form, which still isn't that good. And all of this time you're just like praying your opponent doesn't have removal. So I think Hydra's Growth is not going to end up being very good. I actually think it's probably just a D level card, but if you have some creatures that naturally have some +1/+1 counters, the cards that immediately come to mind are escape cards, because a lot of escape cards are come into play with an extra counter on them, then Hydra's Growth becomes a lot better because it then starts doubling more quickly. So if you have some cards that have natural +1/+1 counters, this is kind of like a build around C+, because if on your next upkeep you add 2 counters, then you've kind of just built your own Oaken form and then have like huge threat from there. But if you don't have any other +1/+1 counters cards, this card's just going to be a D because it is quite slow. Keep in mind, if you do have Hydra's Growth, you want to prioritize other ways to protect the creature. There is a combat trick in white that gives a creature with an aura on it +2/+2 hexproof, and it gives a creature hexproof and indestructible in addition to +2/+2. And if the creature is enchanted, it gets the hexproof and indestructible part. So that's going to be really good if you have Hydra's Growth. And also, if you have, if you're in blue, there's a card that can give your creature hexproof. So you'll want to be able to protect the creature with Hydra's Growth on it. But I think this card's a D, but it's a build around C+, or maybe even a build around B- if you have a good deck for it. Next is Klothys' Design. This one's really hard to evaluate because it is a great card if you have a large amount of devotion and you have a large amount of creatures, but I'm not sure how often that is going to come together, because if you have a lot of creatures, a lot of them are probably going to be tokens, which don't fuel devotion, and if you have a lot of green creatures that are kind of giving you devotion already, it means you probably already have a pretty good board state and don't need Klothys' Design. I think this card's probably just a D. You'll sometimes play it, but the fact that it's a sorcery speed and it's not really guaranteed what it's going to get you, like a lot of the time this might be 6 mana, give you all of your creatures +3/+3, no trample, no evasion, which just isn't very good. So I'm actually going to go D- on this card. I just do not think it is very good. Next is Mystic Repeal. This card's quite powerful. I'm going to give this a B. There's so many enchantments running around in the set, and being able to interact with them for just 1 mana at instant speed is going to be super potent. You can blow people out in combat. You can blow out your opponent, like you can get rid of your opponent's banishing light type effects to get your creatures back and block or attack with them by surprise. This card's going to be very good and very high pick. Next is Nessian Hornbeetle. This is a really nice payoff for the 4 powered creatures matter. It starts off as a 2 mana 2/2, so already that's a C. It doesn't really need, it's like a C-, but doesn't really need that much to be great. And the fact that it can get an extra counter every turn starting as soon as turn 3, because you can play a 3 mana 4 powered creature and then it triggers on combat. It triggering on combat is much better than triggering on your upkeep or something like that. So you can start bashing in as soon as turn 3 with a 3/3 that only gets better. I think this card's quite good. I'm going to give it a C+, but in the deck that cares about 4 powered creatures maybe a little bit more, maybe you've prioritized them, it's going to be all the way up to B-. But in decks that only have like 2 or 3 4 powered creatures, it's still going to be a C+ and quite good. Next is Nessian Wanderer. I'm a huge fan of this card. I think it's probably going to be a B-, but if you build around it, it's a B. It reminds me very much of Dryad Greenseeker from, I believe, M19, which was just one of the best uncommons in the set. And essentially the fact that there's a 2 mana 1/3 that can find you a land consistently, because there's a ton of enchantment creatures, there's a ton of enchantments running around. Nessian Wanderer is going to do a ton of good work, and I think it's probably just going to end up being a B in most green decks that like have taken it relatively early, and then a B- even in the decks that haven't put a ton of work towards it. So I'm going to start off with this at a B or a B-, but it's generally going to be a B, I'm pretty sure. It's just such a powerful card. It's better than all the commons a lot of the time. I would take it very early and prioritize building around it, because landing this on turn 2 is scary for your opponent. It essentially draws you a free card every time you play an enchantment, because looking at the top 3 is pretty likely to find a land. So quite powerful. Next is Nyx Herald. This card's also quite good. I'm going to give this a B-. It doesn't give you like card advantage, but a 3 mana 3/4 Trampler is just really good, and it can buff your other enchantment creatures when it comes into play. Being an enchantment creature itself is also quite valuable, so this is just a straight up B-, very powerful card. Next is Fairies Band Brawler. I actually looked up the card that this is a reprint of. It's the same as Affectionate Indrik from back in Guilds of Ravnica, and that card was fantastic. This card is no different. It's literally the same card, except it costs 4 green instead of 5 and a green, and that does make it a little bit worse for decks that are trying to splash, but given that most of the decks that are splashing are green based, it's not going to be a huge deal, and the 2 pips can actually be a little bit beneficial for devotion. I think on average it's worse than being 5 and a green, but it's still going to be quite good. This card's just a straight up B. 6 mana 4/4 that kills one of their relatively medium sized creatures. Like killing a 3/3 with this is no joke, is going to be super good, and I think you're going to be prioritizing this effect. Next is Renata, Called to the Hunt. This is another fantastic card. It's on its base is a 4 mana 2/3, but it does not take a lot of work to make this a 4 mana 4/3 or even a 4 mana 5/3, and each other creature entering with a counter is super powerful. It's an enchantment creature itself. This card's also going to be a B. It just makes all of your other creatures better. It works pretty well with that Hydra card because it does provide more counter synergies, and overall this card is fantastic, and you're going to want to take this early, and to build around it, all you have to do is put creatures in your deck. Next is Cetizen Petitioner. This card is a devotion payoff that isn't as good for limited because life gain doesn't matter as much. That being said, it's still pretty potent. It's on a 3-mana 2/2, so the body's not irrelevant. 3-mana 2/2 gain 2 life is like a solid card on its own, and it can gain like 4 life sometimes or something like that. So I think it's just a solid C, and if you're a heavy green deck, it goes up to a C+. Next is Wolf Willow Haven. This card is one that I'm really excited to get to play with. If you're building a ramp deck or a deck that can spend its mana, this card is going to be great, and really any deck will benefit from, or a lot of decks will benefit from just getting this down on turn 2, casting a 4-drop on turn 3, and that's just really good. And the fact that it can sacrifice itself in the late game when you don't need the extra mana is really good for this type of card. It triggers all of your constellation effects. It's an aura for cards that care about auras. I really think this card's going to be great, and I'm going to give this card, I'm actually going to start with B-. I think it's just that good, and the fact that they can't kill it with their removal spells is really nice as well. You have to have the right deck for it. You're not just going to throw this into your aggressive deck, but if you have a ramp deck or a deck that can spend its mana pretty well, it's going to be a very powerful card. Next is, we're moving into the rares. Rasta of the Endless Web. 4 mana for a 3/5 reach. I'm already sold. It's an enchantment creature. It's already going to be great. These stats alone is probably going to put me like at C+, and then 4 mana 3/5 reach is a whole mana cheaper than Mammoth Spider. This card's going to be a B- at the very least. And then the fact that if your opponent tries to cast an instant or sorcery, you're going to get a 1/2 Spider with reach, which is probably like worth 1 mana. Like you would pay 1 mana for that happily, or 2 mana sometimes if it came with a couple of them. I don't know. Basically, this card is great. You're going to take, it's a B-, or even, it's probably just a B level card. Fantastic effect on the game. It's an enchantment creature. It's big. It's undercosted. And really good card. Next is Dryad of the Elysian Grove. This is another enchantment creature. Keep in mind when you have enchantment creatures, they are going to be relevant for the game. This really helps you with your multicolored green deck if you are going for that, because your lands can tap for any color. That's what making your land every basic land type does. So Dryad of the Elysian Grove is going to be great for those decks. And playing an additional land is not super good, but this doesn't really need a ton of work to be that powerful. So if you're splashing, this card becomes a B- because it fixes all of your mana. But if you aren't splashing, it's still just a C+, because the 3 mana 2/4 enchantment creature with a little bit of extra upside, making sure you can cast all of your spells. Why did I click that? Next up is the first I Row in Games. This card's also fantastic. I think this card's a B. You make a 1/1, and then you can put 3 counters on the 1/1, so it's essentially a 3 mana 4/4, because by the time that can't really block on its first turn coming into play, because the first trigger happens when it comes into play, and the second trigger happens on your next upkeep. So you're going to have a 3 mana 4/4, which is fantastic. I'm just going to give this a B+. Never mind. Actually, dare I say A-. Have I reached the coveted A range on this card? I just keep talking myself up and up and up. I'm going to give this card an A-. This card is super good. When it comes into play, it triggers all your constellation stuff. It makes a 1/1, which is not absurd, but then you can put the 3 counters anywhere you want. You can put those on the 1/1. You can put them anywhere else you want as well. And then you basically are going to be able to draw 2 cards a lot of the time. You've already made a 4-powered creature if you put the 1/1 and the 3 counters. And by the turn 5, when this trigger... By turn 5, you should have another 4-powered creature in play. If you've cast one on turn 4 a lot of the time, and then you can create a gold token at the end. This card just strikes me as very good. I'm actually going to go down to B+, because if they kill your 4-powered creatures, it's a little bit worse. But this card is fantastic and one of the best cards in set for green. Dang, do I want to go back up to A-? Arg, I really want to give this an A-. I'm going to give it an A-. Let's go. Okay, next up is Mantle of the Wolf. Okay, this is why the A range is coveted, but this is just a straight up A, I think. It's a massive bump on your creature, and when it, like, normally this would say when the creature dies, but it's not just that. It's when Mantle of the Wolf was put into a graveyard. So that means if the creature gets exiled, if the creature gets sacrificed, if killed in I guess you have to make sure that it resolves, but once it does resolve, there's nothing that they can really do other than killing. Even if they kill Mantle of the Wolf, it still goes to the graveyard. So pretty much, if you find a window where this is going to be open, you've just made yourself a massive creature. I'm going to give this an A- because you can interact with the creature in response, but it's going to be fantastic in the set. And the fact that it creates 2 2/2s, you'd already pay 4 mana for 2 2/2s, and the fact that this makes a creature bigger beforehand is really good. So this is an A-. Next is Nessian Boar. This card is one of those ones that looks super scary, but then you realize that its ability is kind of like mediocre. So essentially, Nessian Boar, I think, is probably in the D range, even maybe just a D, because it's a 5 mana 10/6. But as soon as you attack with it, your opponent will probably be able to block it. So if they block it with, say, 3 creatures, like they have to block it with all of their stuff they've played, you hit them for, like, you don't hit them for anything. They trade their creatures, they draw 3 cards, and your Nessian Boar's down. And then when it becomes when all the creatures being able to block it means you can sometimes force through bonus damage with your creatures. Oh man, this card's really tough for me to evaluate. I've had discussions with people and they've been trying to tell like I've been described to why this card isn't great, but I still think it has some potential, and I feel like it's probably still. It's got to be at least in the C range. It can just hold back on defense and block whatever they play for all time. Yeah, I'm gonna give this a C plus. I think it's gonna be it's gonna play out better than people think it will. Yeah. This card strikes me as pretty good. Like, I'm just it's really tough to evaluate, but I think it's a C plus because it's a 10/6 for 5 mana that can just block anything, and then the fact that everything has to block it means that on a key turn you can just attack this into everything, kill 4 of their creatures, and have them draw 4 cards, but you still get in for like 6 damage. Yeah, I'm gonna give this a C plus. I don't think it quite reaches B minus level. But I still think this card's fantastic. Maybe it is a B minus, but only time will tell. Next up is Nylaia's Intervention. It's either a massive land search or a massive flyer search. You pretty much want to be able to use all the lands you get, so you want to be either splashing or something like that. But regardless, the fact that it can kill flyers makes it a potent sideboard card. I think this is probably just a C, and then like a C, and then if you're playing like a C out of the sideboard if you're playing in a matchup that cares about flyers, maybe. If it's a matchup that cares about flyers, I'm sorry about my slow evaluations on the rares, but the rares are ones that I haven't seen quite as much. I've definitely looked at them a couple times, but I sometimes forget all the rares. So yeah, I think this card's going to probably be a B sideboard card, and if you care about getting lands out of your deck or you're splashing or something, then it's probably going to be a C plus level main deck card, because there are going to be some times where killing the flyers is relevant even in main deck situations. Next is Citizen Champion. I think this card is great. Absolutely, like, fantastic. Like, putting a counter on your creature, drawing a card. This is one of the constellation payoffs that really rewards you. This card's probably going to be a B plus, and in the index that have built around it, because it is relatively squishy to start with, but it gets you your value right away. So maybe it's even an A minus index that are going to consistently trigger it. But I'm going to start at B plus. I gave those other cards A minuses. Let's just go for it. I'm going to give Citizen Champion an A minus if you can build. It's not great to top deck it later, so I'm going to give it a B+, but I still think this card is great. Next up, we are finally at the Mythics. We start with Nylaia Keen-Eyed. This card is pretty good compared to the other gods. It's only 4 mana. As always, if you can get this triggered, which green seems much better at doing than other colors, it's going to be fantastic. Creatures cost less, which is also fantastic for this card. It makes the card like the 3 green, 6/7 much better, because you can curve Nylaia into that and pretty much always have Devotion online then. And then the ability is quite nice because it'll eventually draw you cards. It'll draw you, on average, maybe a third of a card, depending on how you build your deck, maybe even closer to half a card. So I think Nylaia Keen-Eyed is going to be a B+. This card strikes me as quite good. In a deck that's heavier green, it definitely gets into the A range, and I just think this card has a lot of high upside and really seems powerful to me. Next up, our final card in green is Nyx Bloom Ancient. I don't think this card is great. Sure, it's an enchantment creature, but you're never going to have good enough mana sinks that tripling your mana is worth it. So I think this card is just a D. Sometimes you'll play it, and if you have mana sinks, it is a build around like B-, because if you have mana sinks, then you cast this card, you can just use those mana sinks like 100 times, but I don't think there's really that type of mana sink in the format. I can't recall them off the top of my head, so I think this card's going to generally be a D. That is going to do it for the green set review. Thank you so much for watching and making it all the way to the end. If you did make it to the end, in the comments, remember to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment if you have any questions or feedback, and leave a hashtag green review in the comments to let me know you made it all the way to the end. That is going to do it for this video. If you want to check out my other set reviews for Theros Beyond Death, you can find them on my YouTube channel. And I do hope you enjoy those as well. Let me know what you thought. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll talk to you next time.